Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Supplemental. An interview with Dr. Darrick Taylor on Montanism. The specter of Montanism hangs over the entire life of Tertullian of Carthage. Even before he identified with the movement, his contributions to orthodoxy would later be questioned due to his association with this strange and, by some standards at least, heretical movement. Today, we have a special podcast treat as we attempt to understand the Montanists, also known as the New Prophecy, a little bit better. My guest on the podcast today is Dr. Darrick Taylor. Dr. Taylor teaches history, Dr. Taylor teaches humanities at Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida, and runs the Controversies in Church History podcast. I was very, very fortunate to be on Dr. Taylor's podcasts last year talking about my book, and I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Taylor with us to chat a little bit about Montanism, which is an area of particular interest for him. I hope you enjoy our conversation, remembering, as always, that in a two-mic situation where, well, since he's in Florida and I'm in Indiana, we had to do it over Zoom, the audio quality might be a tad different than what you're used to. Still, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Darrick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so glad to have you here. And as you know, we're chatting a little bit about Montanism. So I was wondering if you could tell our listeners, just kind of at a basic level, what exactly is Montanism, aka the New Prophecy? When was it founded, and what distinguished it from quote-unquote Catholic Christianity?
Yes, the so-called New Prophecy originated sometime either before or just after the year 170, the best dating we have for this, in what is modern-day Turkey, probably around central Turkey. And its progenitor is a man known to us as Montanus. Montanus, I don't know how you pronounce it. And he was, by all accounts, by the earliest accounts we have, a Christian convert who claimed to receive direct inspirations from God, and who apparently had these ecstatic experiences, which included things like speaking in tongues, convulsions, physical convulsions, making prophecies. We still have what are referred to as Montanist oracles left behind recorded by opponents of Montanus. And what distinguishes it, he basically, and this gets through in some of this stuff, him and his followers, his earliest followers, thought they were receiving divine revelation, that they were basically the sort of they basically were getting the same sort of revelation the apostles did, effectively. And so that's really the biggest thing, are these sort of experiences. And he quickly gained a following, and in particular he was joined by two prophetesses, two women named Priscilla and Maximilla, who became very prominent in the movement as well. And it came into conflict pretty quickly with church authorities, who didn't, of course, agree that this was God speaking to them, basically. So that's it.
Yeah. And, you kind of bring up the centrality of these ecstatic experiences, and it kind of makes me feel like, at least sort of in the circles I run, people will sort of describe the Montanists as sort of like ancient Pentecostals, right? Kind of comparing sort of what you see in a Pentecostal worship service, which, a lot of similarities in terms of prophecies being given, ecstatic stuff. I'm just curious for you, sort of how helpful are those comparisons versus unhelpful?
They're kind of helpful, actually. And I say this not because the setting's wildly different. We'll get to the historical
Right,
second.
yeah.
But I mean, the thing about just to go with the name, right? We're calling them New Prophecy here. This is apparently what they called themselves. This is
Yeah.
what Tertullian II, he uses that phrase. Their opponents called them Montanists or Phrygians, and apparently the term, because it comes from ancient Phrygia, is part of Turkey, modern Turkey. That was apparently a slam against them, that this was coming from some sort of pagan, like sort of mystical experience or something. And so there's already this sort of pushback against it. But there's no actual evidence for that. He does seem to have been a Christian. His followers were all Christians. And of course, there is, and I say this as a modern Western Christian, the Christian faith is a charismatic one. We do believe the Holy
Mhm.
Spirit comes to you after you're baptized.
Right.
And yet, a lot of modern Christians, they don't. It's not something it's really actively, we don't actually think about it a lot. We don't really, it doesn't come into unless you are of like a Pentecostal background or some sort of charismatic background. And yet it's kind of part of the deal. And so, you mentioned, talking about this, my podcast on this, I called it the perennial heresy,
Hmm.
partly because, yeah, inspirations from God are a part of the Christian faith. So it's not something you can, and this is something we'll talk about here. You mentioned it was a good question. What distinguishes it from the Christian faith? That's a good question in that period,
Yeah.
actually. It's
Mhm.
not necessarily always going to, because there were a lot of groups that were having not a lot, but there were people having ecstatic experiences who weren't be accused of Montanism and stuff like that. A lot of it just does go back to this individual and his first followers, right? They do eventually develop well, it's again a different. It becomes a movement on its own, but
Mhm.
I would say throughout its history, it's several hundred years. It kind of exists as a movement like that, but also partly because it is this ecstatic movement, it doesn't necessarily have always the clearest boundaries.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
we'll talk about this more because it's just the spirit, right? It's not anything. It refers really intensely to those experiences
Mhm.
and what the people experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to riff on that for a second, I mean, I think about my experience as a parish priest, right?
Sure.
Because at least I was surprised, um, maybe other people wouldn't be, but I was surprised how often people will talk about having sort of quote unquote mystical experiences or experiences of God, you know.
Sure.
Um, and for some people, it may only happen a couple of times in a lifetime, you know, where it's like they're alone and they hear a voice say something that they needed to hear, or a thought comes to their head and there's just a really strong sense that like that did not come from me.
Mhm.
Um, and then on the other hand, you have people who will claim that same thing, and it's pretty clear that they're bipolar and they're in the middle of a manic episode. Oh, yeah, you know, as you say, it's always interesting to figure out where the boundaries are because, you know, there is an openness that I think a lot of people
Mhm.
have, but that openness is not just openness to God, right?
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
that
Well,
sort of becomes a
and they,
fun part of the discernment you do in parochial
oh,
work. Yeah.
yeah. I can imagine. Well, in the ancient world, they could distinguish between
Hmm.
madness and divine inspiration. And of course, they also, and this is when we come to this, they distinguish between, of course, divine inspiration that comes from God and that becomes from the demonic, which is
Right.
what a lot of the critics said about Montanus, and they're like, well, this can't be. And so, but yes, I mean, the people, it can be, strange experiences are strange. They're hard to categorize and they're hard to get a hold of.
Hmm.
And so it can be, and this for me, I am an adult convert to Christianity. I'm a Latin Rite Roman Catholic, but it's very intellectualized. It took me a while to get used to that whole idea.
Hmm.
It's very weird, but as I gotten older, I think it's something you have to be open to.
Yeah.
You don't have to. I don't have a lot of experiences like that. I do have some,
Hmm.
but it's something you can't just like. Well, don't write that off as psychological. Because if you once you understand the world has a spiritual reality, there are bad spirits.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
have learned that the hard way. Like you can give into things you shouldn't give into. And so
Mhm.
all that's in the background of this with Montanus and what his followers are, they come into pretty quickly gain a following, pretty quickly begin to clash with church
Yeah.
authorities. And it's interesting, very interesting trying to follow it because, like a lot of things, especially because it arises in the late second century, The vast majority of our sources are, again, post-Constantine. There are two big narratives. Eusebius in the early part of the 320s or whatever in his ecclesiastical history, and then in the 370s, Epiphanius of Salamis. So we're talking 2 centuries after this. Eusebius does collect writers he says are writing at the time, but not much direct evidence. There is some from from around that period, and of course Tertullian's one of the biggest ones because he is one of the few, maybe the only big name whose a defense of them survives. So interesting history.
Yeah. And for those of you who are maybe getting inspired by this conversation, read more church history yourself. Just be prepared to hear the names Eusebius and Epiphanius a lot. Because,
Um,
part of what we're doing is there are really just a couple of people that we have available to us who are writing histories of this period, and those are two of the big ones. And as you talk about this clash with church officials, one of the areas of clash had to do with ethical standards. And, Montanus, kind of the most famous one, at least to me, is that he forbids remarriage. And, even in St. Paul's case, right? Like there are cases where you can have a remarriage, particularly if your spouse has died. And Montanus says essentially, as far as we know, he says, nope, no remarriage. Like you get a marriage, it's a one-time thing. Why, to the extent that we can answer this question, why did he do that? What was his justification for sort of going beyond the apostle?
Sure. Well, in terms of those terms, it's worth noting there were a lot of things that they enjoined on their
Mm.
followers, or at least tried to encourage things like really more strict fasts
Yeah.
than the contemporary church. They praised virginity in outlandish terms, and as you said, this is the big thing: is marriage. They urged husbands and wives to either live continently or separate and things like this. It was really extreme. And of course, they also rejected fleeing from persecution. This will become an issue as well. I think part of this has to do with, and I've looked at some of their actual oracles, it seems to me part of this has to do with a drive for, there seems to be some link to purity. That is to say, if you're going to receive, the Spirit, the Paraclete, they talk about better appearances of the Paraclete in addition to appearances of Christ and their visions, you have to be pure. And so there's this emphasis on it. I think that's the big connection. Otherwise, it is. I think there's something they don't mention this specifically, but there does seem to be a sense that, and this is me extrapolating in the background of all this. Like this is what 170, we'll say, Montanus begins getting his visions. We're what, if you depending on how you calculate it, 3 or 4 generations from the death, resurrection of Christ, right? The early Christians clearly had an apocalyptic understanding of this, that it's going to, the world's ending soon, Christ will return to us. At some point, it dawns on them, okay, his time schedules aren't ours. What do we do now?
Mhm.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, like the 180s, what Irenaeus of Lyons writing his works, and he's one of the first to mention things like apostolic succession. Same time frame you have, I believe that's when some of the first lists of the canon of scripture begin to be written down. People are beginning to say, okay, now how do we live our lives day to day? We're not expecting the immediate coming of Christ.
Mhm.
And, there are different possible sources of guidance, right? There's tradition, as the one, scripture. And then, of course, something that must have seemed like to these people, like not just traditional, but hey, this is what the apostles, they had that divine spirit. Why don't we should have that, right? I believe, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Old Testament prophecy with the prophet Joel, like, that your spirit will be poured out on my people. We're
Your
supposed
sons
to,
and daughters shall prophesy. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. We're supposed to have that. That's not that's not a thing in the past. It's still present. That's something it gets into if your listeners want to read one of the most amazing things that comes out of the early church and one of the most amazing documents I think I have ever read. There are these passio, these recounts of martyrs. One of the most famous, I used to teach this in my Western Civ classes, is the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas.
Mm-hmm.
I sincerely wish to this day some enterprising filmmaker would make a short film of this because it is mind blowing. But it recounts, of course, the death of these 2 Christian women in the arena in North Africa, same time frame as Tertullian. And at the very beginning, it talks about in that work, well, we are having we're having inspirations the same way that our ancestors did. So there's already clear this sense they're sensing a distance from the faith as they've received it. I think they want to get back to it. And I think that's why there's this urge to, we talked about this when you came on my podcast last time
Mm.
about Nicaea and Constantine, how yes, it did become the church more institutional after that. It was already becoming an institution, though. By the
Yeah.
third century, bishops are important figures in their communities, even beyond the church. And
Yeah.
so there's naturally going to be a little bit of, I maybe probably tend to think of these things in maybe two Weberian terms, but like, charismatic people found great institutions, but then you have to go on without them. And that means routines and bureaucracy
Mhm.
and stuff like this. And for some of these people, I think that seemed maybe this is very like anachronistic. It might have seemed like inauthentic, right? We have to get the real spirit. We can't
Mhm.
just take it from these. We'll get to Tertullian. He has a nice. He's great at turning phrases. He has a term for these people who aren't spiritual enough. But it may have seemed like that, and I think that's the reason for the
Mhm.
extremity, right? When you're not finding what you're looking for as a seeker in the mainstream, you go to the margins, which tend to be a little more radical. At least that's
Mhm.
what my guess, because it doesn't say exactly in the sources.
Yeah, and in some ways, I wonder if that kind of, I mean, this is kind of a hard binary to posit because, like, I often sort of compare in my head the Church of Montanus with the church in Corinth, right? Because you have
Sure.
similar kind of ecstatic. So, and the church in Corinth is very definitely charismatic and apocalyptic. That, because there's all kinds of speaking in tongues and prophecies. And, Paul, like the biggest part of the letter to the Corinthians is basically saying, okay, like simmer down, you know. Um,
Yes.
like it's good that you're speaking in tongues. It's good that there are prophecies, but you also need to focus a little bit more on some of the basics, like not desecrating the Lord's Supper and not condoning incest and actually loving each other, which is the context for, the passage from First Corinthians that everybody loves and reads at weddings, love is patient, love is kind. I mean, Paul has just laid out here are all the spiritual gifts, but greater than any prophecy is the gift of love.
Yeah, and one of the things to mention about I mentioned speaking in tongues. One of the big criticisms that opponents will hurl at these Montanists is that they blame them for basically confusing, well, not confusing, but sort of identifying like the Holy Spirit with like speaking in tongues. Basically, the idea
Mhm.
if you're not having these same ecstatic experiences, you haven't really received God's Spirit and everything like this. And so that
Right.
becomes criticism. You're focusing too much on extraordinary experiences,
Hmm.
which is an interesting thing. One of my favorite things to read from the ancient Christian world is are selections. I have selections of the sayings of the Desert Fathers, right?
Yeah.
Very different movement, kind of reacting against after the empire becomes Christian and everything,
Mm.
separating from the world. A lot of those sayings will say things like, if you have some sort of vision or experience or miracle, just go through it and leave it alone. Don't obsess about it. They're very inconsistent about that. Whereas again, Montanists, they take the opposite tack, right? You should seek for those things. They're
Mhm.
signs that you're really one of the saved.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of all that, you mentioned one of the interesting things about Montanus is that there are these two prophetesses, these two women who become associated with him and become really big figures in the movement. What do you make of that and kind of the role of women in the new prophecy vis-a-vis other churches?
It's fascinating because first of all, Priscilla and Maximilla, again, scholars have tried to suss out which of the oracles that mostly their opponents record are actually authentic. A lot of the authentic ones come from Priscilla and Maximilla. They seem to have
Mm,
been at least as important, if not more important than Montanus. They outlive him, like sort of for about a few years, apparently.
yeah.
And so they have a definite role. You can do that. There are it's murky before the second century, but by the third century, you do have like, and again, the thing with widows is kind of, I've always found it kind of like murky because is it an official role, is it institutional? But in the third century, you will have appearing in the East deaconesses. You will have them, they assist at baptisms and stuff like this. But the thing about that makes them different there is they're kind of outside of all that. I do know, for example, Tertullian didn't have a high view of like institutional roles for women, but he didn't mind. He didn't mind the ecstatic one, right?
Mm.
This is sort of an exception he makes, and I think that's probably what may have attracted them, may have attracted some of their followers. We don't. We have very the evidence is very sketchy because unfortunately a lot of it has been destroyed by their opponents. Is the
Yeah.
problem, but it is an interesting thing. I know, I don't really see any don't really see any pagan influence in all this, but it's
Mhm.
possible like there is an idea that women are somehow because they're more susceptible to things like
Mhm.
inspirations. Maybe that's part of it. But they have a prominent role in the movement. One of the earliest references we have to the Montanists is in Origen, and he
Mhm.
goes off. He really hates. I think he mentions Priscilla and Maximilla by name.
Mhm.
He recites, Paul from First Corinthians against women speaking in. He's a long passage on this. There's a
Mhm.
lot of scholarship on this, obviously, because this is obviously something modern scholars would care about. And so it seems to have attracted attention. Although from what I saw, it wasn't the biggest point of criticism by his opponents. They were mostly, well, there was a title of a book I would recommend. It's actually good, by a scholar who I believe, if I've read enough of him to say, I think he's some sort of charismatic Christian. Fake Prophecy and Polluted Sacraments. It's
Yeah.
about opponents saw, and they don't seem to make. I mean, they do. I mean, Origen's the bear. He does go off.
Mm.
Uh, but it seemed more consistently that they're really concerned about, they think, well, I'll give you an example. One of the earliest things, and this is, I think, Maximilla, or either Maximilla or Priscilla. There's a story in the sources that a local bishop tried to perform an exorcism on her. But the Hermontanist followers prevented him from doing it. They thought,
Mm.
I took literally she was demonically possessed, but they wouldn't allow it. So it was more. I think it caused controversy because I think all Christians understood. Well, yeah, you're still getting inspirations, but wait a minute, this conflicts a little bit with, we have these bishops growing in importance, and we're working this stuff out.
Mhm.
It was the primary. I think the whole issue of just inspiration, and how do you know that's the Holy Spirit, right? This gets to that obvious question.
Mhm.
And I will say this. I mean, there is, as far as I could tell, no evidence Montanus actually was excommunicated in his
Mhm.
lifetime. I don't think Priscilla or Maximilla were. That's the thing. A lot of it depends on, okay, they do say they're getting direct messages from God. They have this authority, but it's not always necessarily clear that they are. So you get to Tertullian, we'll get to him in a
Yeah.
second, because he will actually talk much more. He being very brilliant author that he was, I think maybe puts a little more, like, there's a little more firmness there. But I have to imagine there are a lot of like parts of this that are probably on the fringes, or even like within the boundaries of the wider church at the time.
Mhm.
Hard to tell because of the state of the evidence.
I do think one of the things that you often see is that charismatic movements have a way of, well, I say destabilizing, but not in like a negative sense, right? Sort of like upending sexuality and then gender along with that, right?
True. Yeah,
Um,
arrangements. Yeah.
yeah, so it's like it's not for nothing that in the letters to the Corinthians, which, that's the only church that we know where Paul really talks about those charismatic gifts. That's also the church where you get most of the most complimentary passages about women in church leadership,
Right.
right? So Paul's like, yeah, of course a woman can prophesy in church, just, she should have her head covered out of respect for the angels, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
as opposed to the pastorals where, they're saying, well, of course a woman can't teach.
Yeah.
Um, and I've sometimes wondered if that has something to do, like, oftentimes when Jesus is talking about the world to come, it's in a way that sort of upsets our expectations. When the
True.
Sadducees ask him, "Hey, this woman had seven husbands. Who's she going to be married to?" He didn't, interestingly enough, he didn't say, "Well, that's a stupid question because obviously she can only be married one time and you can never get married again." High five, Montanus. Um, but he does say that's a stupid question because people don't get married in the age to come.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, and so there are systems of like that, male and female don't work the same way when you have this kind of inbreaking of the Holy Spirit.
And that may be another, if you're talking about why the Montanists were so extreme in some ways, that again, I'm comparing it to monasticism because
Mhm.
monastic movement is sometimes called the angelic life because it's trying to anticipate the resurrected world,
Right.
and that may be something like that with the Montanists, where yeah, women are just sort of because we have the direct spirit, right? And what do you have that, then you should be able to.
Mhm.
And just one last thought on that, especially because it does arise in Asia Minor. A lot of again, the earliest evidence for deaconesses comes from that milieu, which is interesting. Because a lot of the deaconesses, like the earliest descriptions are, is they minister almost wholly to women,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
from the Middle East, where they're just to this day actually very sex segregated. But on the other hand, there is some sort of idea they should have something to do, is the thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
But it is interesting about Montanus, and you don't really, again, we don't know so little actually about the details. Like we get this tantalizing stuff.
Yeah.
Like for example, one of the oracles of Maximilla, she declares herself, by the way, the last of the prophetesses.
Hmm.
Basically, apparently Montanus and those two especially thought this is the last age of prophecy and we're the last ones. Their followers, after they died, said, no, it's ongoing still, apparently.
Go
But
back and put an asterisk next to that part of the oracle, you know.
Sure, but it is about if you're thinking about them asserting authority. It's interesting that it does occur there. It does. Again, you're looking for that anticipation. That's why I'm assuming they became Christians. It's a hopeful religion, right? Like you are
Mhm.
not going to be, you know, you're not going to be like if you were whatever on the bottom of whatever hierarchy, you're not going to be super oppressed for all time. That is
Mhm.
coming, right? And especially the earliest Christians must have believed Christ. That's going to happen soon.
Mhm.
And so it is interesting the tensions and what they make of that.
Yeah.
Um, wish you had some more like information, but it's
I
not
know,
there.
yeah. We're starved for information from them. One person we are less starved for information from, as you've mentioned a couple of times, is our dear friend Tertullian. Um,
Yes.
so obviously, he's really important. And I mean, what a lot of scholars sort of think happen is that kind of at around middle age, Tertullian sort of finds out about the new prophecy and becomes one of its most enthusiastic proponents. It's like how do we understand that? What was sort of happening there and the importance of, Tertullian's advocacy for it?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I don't know the exact reasons why he embraces it. I think probably again, I'll have to like speculate, and I don't want to
Mhm.
psychologize the man, but Tertullian, of course, is one of, I mean, really aside from Augustine, I would say probably the most important early Christian theologian. I mean, he's really important.
Mhm.
Um, he has an intellect that I think is comparable to Augustine's. I mean, he invents half of the terms we use in Western theology. His what's the name? It's the against Praxeus, I think, is
Yeah.
the term where he contributes something to the definition of the Trinity, which we'll get into dogmatic definitions at church councils later on.
Hmm.
He's trained as probably because he's trained as a lawyer and everything. My point is he's a very intellectual guy, and I wonder if he isn't attracted to the direct immediacy of what the Montanists are giving him, right?
Mhm.
No, you have to like talk about it. Here's the actual experience. Even though, from what I understand, he doesn't ever talk about himself having those experiences, but he defends them to the hilt. Because again, I think he wants to say, look, I have this battened down. Here's my arguments. Here's my intellectual construct, but here's the actual thing right here, right? You can say it's right there. That and there are some things in his background. I know in some of his writings he talks about like when he was a young man, he had problems with lust, indulged in lust. I think he actually admits at one point he committed adultery. So
Mhm.
if you're someone who coming from that sort of milieu, and then of course you have these people stressing purity, right? I can think of modern parallels to put it mildly. People who like get attracted to extreme movements, who are intelligent and
Yeah.
who they want some of that. As I'm sure you're aware, people who are very intellectual sometimes separate themselves from their emotional lives, and not a healthy. I've done this, not a healthy way sometimes. And perhaps he's looking for that more integrated experience like this. This must be the real thing, right? They're
Mhm.
they're ascetics like the early Christians were. They're ascetics like the apostles were. They're getting visions like the apostles were. And so perhaps it's that. And again, he's a brilliant guy, obviously.
Hmm.
And so maybe that's what he was looking for. But I think he does, and this gets us to his criticisms of the contemporary church of this time. He coins this term. I think I'm pronouncing this the right way. You can correct me. Psychic, I think is the term. I
Yes.
can't.
Hmm.
This is, yeah, he's portraying the contemporary churchmen, bishops as being they're too materialistic, right? They're too thingies of the world, right? And again, this is my theory is that the church is becoming more and more a normal part, quote unquote. It's still legally prescribed, they're still persecuted from time to time,
Yeah.
but it's becoming a familiar part of the Roman society. That's why you have people like Celsus, who was a brilliant pagan philosopher, taking the time and trouble to try to refute Christianity.
Hmm.
It's part of it may be hated, but it's not like what early 112 or so. Pliny the Younger writes this. I love that letter.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
writing this, like these Christians do this weird thing. I don't know, but by the end of that century, they know the Christians. They read the
Right.
writings, and I think there's a little bit of that in Tertullian. Like these guys, they're fake. The people who lead this church, these are the real Christians. These are the people who truly have the Spirit. And as you mentioned before, that is something that's a temptation of people who have that kind of sensibility.
Hmm.
We've had this experience. It might mean, and Tertullian definitely thought of themselves as being like one of the real Christians. Perhaps that I don't mean to denigrate the man at all. I'm not trying to do that, but it does seem like that maybe an attraction to him.
Yeah. Well, and longtime listeners know that I'm also a mental health counselor. So, like, to put on
Oh,
my clinical psychology hat for a minute, there is there's good evidence that there are certain kinds of personalities that sort of cope with the necessary pains of life by
mm,
restricting and controlling what comes into their heads.
sure.
And so this kind of sense of like controlling what comes in and what comes out
Yeah.
becomes really important. And like there are very different ways that people will do this. So like at kind of lower levels of maturity, we'll see people who are just really, really concrete in their thinking. It's sort of like the material reality is all that is, and
Mhm.
there isn't, there can't be anything more than that. Now, if you're going to be a lawyer, you have to be able to think abstractly. So Tertullian's probably like a more advanced
So,
version of that. But like that sense of, sort of restricting, which I think often goes along with anxieties about like if I allow myself to feel this lust, then I'm going to go and commit adultery. Like it's very hard to think about the break happening between thought and action. Yeah, and then I think sort of there's a parallel movement in church history that certainly like the African church from a very early time is really, really interested in questions of purity and definition.
mhm,
And in part, I think because persecutions, for whatever reason, seem to have been more frequent in Africa than other parts of the empire. At
mhm,
least we have more records of them.
mhm,
But, and I think you see this in Tertullian. I think you see it in other folks in the area as well. There is just such a sense of we are a persecuted group, and it is
mhm,
so important that we stay close to the true faith and not fall away. And I think that lines up really well with kind of Tertullian's natural personality. So you
mhm,
get this sense of wanting a group with really, really strong boundaries and also really, really high ethical expectations.
mhm.
Because if you let morally lax people in and you don't do something about it, then, they can corrupt the church, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great observation because he is also someone who, I mean, well, he's brilliant at making definitions. I mean, that's what he invented the term Trinity. Like, I think
Yeah.
that one way or the other. Like, I mean, he's just a very brilliant guy, and I think that fits. Yeah, and I was thinking about again going back to like the church itself, like where are the boundaries, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
is it just the charismatic people? Is it all these other things? How do you, and then trying to negotiate that, right? And
Hmm.
so sometimes the response to confusion is limit and simplify, right? Let's put it
Hmm.
down to this experience. And it's not necessarily wrong, but it can go extreme ways, obviously. I
Yeah.
think it's a really sharp observation about Tertullian. He has that kind of personality, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and which I guess leads me to the question of sort of what do you make of Tertullian? Because as you say, he is brilliant. And certainly for those of us in Western Christianity, the two most prominent ancient voices in the church are him and Augustine. Like that's it, no question.
Mhm.
So like he's so important for Orthodox Christians, and he was associated with a movement that got condemned. Like I'm just
Mhm.
curious how you understand that dual significance.
Yeah, part of it has to do with just with the way things work out.
Mm.
The church doesn't develop. They may develop to a crisis point. The solution doesn't come automatically.
Right.
In his time period, things are just kind of not defined. That's part of what maybe he's reacting against in his embrace of Montanism. Because there are, in the ancient world, there are the other figures, a contemporary, I think,
Hmm.
who, same thing. He's important for the church's theology, but he also wrote some things that were very much would not be part of Orthodoxy today. Would be Origen,
Hmm.
uh, brilliant thinker, and at the time, those things hadn't been. The church hadn't been to a point where they could, okay, clearly, in a formal way, in a simple way, in a general way, make a statement. Okay, this is definitely not part of the Christian faith.
Hmm.
And he's such a brilliant thinker. And you could kind of think of this in terms of, on the one hand, you could say there are two types of theology: baseline theology, that's sort of like, consensual, traditional, whatever, that you have common opinions. And there are theologians that he called it exploratory. They
Hmm.
have to go
Yeah.
different directions, they break out. And sometimes that may lead to brilliant insights. Other times it may lead to places you shouldn't do. And
Hmm.
Tertullian seems like that kind of character. Like he wanted to, like, because he is, you could say, kind of control. He's trying to get a handle on these
Hmm.
kind of ideas and concepts. And that's why sometimes when he grasped it, it was so important for the church, they could not let it go. That's probably why, I'm certain that's why, of all the defenses of Montanism, his are the only ones that survived because did become part of Orthodox. They were useful for the Orthodox party in a
Hmm.
later period. And it's really not, in a way, you could say I guess you could say it's political, but I think it's, in a way, it's the wisdom of the church that sometimes they do. I mean, I've even heard, for example, someone like Pelagius, who, of course, this is Augustine, his great opponent. The ancients, even after he was condemned, still valued some of his writings on asceticism, because even though, yeah, you can't work your way to heaven, you can't do that,
Hmm.
but we still believe in doing, works of asceticism. We still believe in doing that. He wrote some spiritually edifying things. And I should mention, by the way, again, no evidence that, I mean, there's a story from Jerome. I love
Hmm.
St. Jerome, but like he repeats the story that Montanus died outside of the church. Again, no real evidence from that from contemporaries. And so it's perfectly possible he died in communion with the church.
Hmm.
So maybe I'll talk about here in a minute about the course of Montanism. It may have been that there may have been a lot of people who were Montanists who may have had experiences. They may never have known. It's possible they never knew they were part of a movement outside the
Right.
church. They've
Yeah.
just been, they didn't know any better. It's only people like Tertullian, who's so brilliant and so self-aware, where they might say, "Well, I have to define it," and so they wind up sort
Hmm.
of defining against certain things that will eventually become, heterodox or heresy or whatever like that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting thought because yeah, I was glad you brought it up. Talking about it, the questions you gave me, it's like that's a really important. It's just really important for it. The theology of the church.
Yeah, and I think so much of it too is like appreciating kind of the messiness of the time. So,
Sure.
because at least sort of messy compared to our own standards.
Our standards are
Where
pretty messy.
yeah, yeah. Um,
we, we we do like to make our messes
we
occasionally.
do, we do. But at least we have canon laws on the books, so we know when we're making messes.
From a later period, we developed things to deal with certain.
Right.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so like it's, when I get asked sometimes like why wasn't so and so condemned? I mean, for example, like among some of the so-called Gnostics, there's no evidence Valentinus was ever condemned as a heretic in his own lifetime. Um,
Yeah.
some other folks too that, it may have happened, it may not, but I also just will often say, well, there was no church-wide structure to kick somebody out. At most, that's the decision of your local bishop, but we're living, this is all happening in a time period before bishops have really consolidated their power. Um,
Mhm.
Folks like Montanus and others were often traveling teachers.
Mhm.
So, and bishops at this point, the only authority they have is the authority their parishioners give them. So, if a charismatic teacher comes and everybody thinks they're the bomb.com, I mean, what are you going to do? You can condemn them, but then your flock's just going to leave. Um, and even if you're able to assert your authority in that town, they can easily just move on to the next one, right? So, it may well be that there were some bishops who said, "Oh, this movement is terrible and we have to get rid
Mhm.
of it." There's some evidence from Tertullian's complaints that that's what happened in Rome. Yeah, he
Yeah,
sort of
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, so at the beginning of against Praxius, he whines that Praxius, whoever that is, and it may be purposely an anonymous thing. He complains that Praxius was basically responsible for getting the Montanists in trouble with the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah.
Um, so
And that second, Eusebius, yeah, he writes about that later on as well.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah,
and that you're exactly right because I mean, we do have evidence. For example, there are like church orders, like procedures are drawn up in the third and fourth centuries for receiving Montanists back into the church in local churches. So in some places they clearly did sort of find themselves, they got into a fight, they had a spat, and some places they came back, right?
yeah,
So there is like, it's not, it didn't have the same effect everywhere as it clearly
yeah,
didn't. And another thing about this is it's so, because there are more groups in that time period who also make, claims to direct, divine inspiration. Not always clear that they're like, I mean, for example, there's a big argument, scholars argue about this stuff all the time, about whether or not Perpetua and Felicitas, maybe they were Montanists, right?
yep,
Possible, there's no way to tell.
yeah,
But it's possible. It's also possible they're just North African Christians who are very, very, very charismatic anyway.
right,
And so this is a problem because they use that term Phrygian constantly, and you're not always sure they mean the Montanists. It might not mean them.
mhm,
So, and all this is polemic anyway. So you have all this stuff trying to do about it. But it's a great point that it would not have had the same effect everywhere. Clearly didn't. And it is concentrated. You do have it in North Africa, probably North Africa, and again the East. Particularly, it's in Palestine to an extent. Egypt, much less so.
mhm,
In Rome, it's in there are Montanists in Rome, but not universal in certain areas. So another
mhm,
interesting point about it.
yeah, yeah. It makes me wonder if the siesta culture of Southern Europe was kind of the barrier to Montanism. It's sort of like it hits Italy and it stops, when everybody's like, we could stay here speaking in tongues, but we've got a nap to eat and, good
Yeah,
Italian
not during the
restaurant.
siesta. The Holy Spirit cannot descend during the siesta, right? You can't do that. Can't do that. I have a good friend who does like Spanish colonial literature and everything. I meant to see him last weekend. He was like, yeah, like he's talking about like they just middle of the day, just log off. They go back and work at night. And
Oh
it's
yeah.
like that's a really civilized thing to do. But yeah, not as
Mhm.
intense, not as intense as those North Africans, not by a long shot. So
Yeah, when I was
that's the serious intensity. So.
yeah. Well, and you mentioned something earlier that I think is really interesting. You talked about there are procedures in the third and fourth centuries for receiving Montanists back into church, which
Mm,
means that the movement endures for centuries. So, can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about the course of its history? I mean, we don't have Montanist churches today, so like when does it die out? How long does it survive?
Well, it basically is petered out only by the end of the sixth, beginning of the seventh century.
Okay, yeah.
It survives longest in Phrygia, in Asia Minor, in
Mhm.
Turkey. It's probably gone in North Africa, or the record disappears in North Africa by the end of the fourth century, which,
Mhm.
again, talking about like maybe blending with other groups, they sound like prime candidates for Donatism, that they might
Yeah,
actually just
yeah.
feed something like that. And so it's hard to tell. I think it never had a big hold in Egypt or Palestine. We do know what happens there too. What that part of that is the diffuse nature of it. The other part is the Christian Roman state, as soon as it becomes Christianized, begins basically passing laws
Hmm.
against groups like this, and they're mentioned in a lot of these laws for Geans from the early fourth century under Constantine up until Justinian. Similar laws are passed, confiscating their property, banning their meetings in public, heavy fines, and occasionally even death as sentences for this.
Hmm.
And this is you have again Constantine the fourth century, late fourth, early fifth century. A couple of emperors clamped down. That seems to, along with I want to say it's the early fifth. So yeah, early fifth century. Pope Innocent the First expelled the Montanists from Rome. That
Hmm.
seems to lead to its slow decline in the West. In the East, it lasts much longer. The person most responsible for that, obviously, would be Justinian. He's the one who he puts more laws on the books in the 530s, but the thing he does is that he puts the screws to the bishops and says, you're going to have to enforce this.
Hmm.
And I forgot to mention this. I have to mention this because I have no idea about this. Besides having these visions, this is weird. I'd love to know more about this. I wish they hadn't. Well, give it a minute. Montanists thought he identified the place where the New Jerusalem would descend to earth in Revelation.
Mm.
There's a town in southwestern Turkey. Archaeologists think they've discovered actually two of them. Papuza is the main one, and Timian. And this became a pilgrimage site for centuries for these
Mm.
Montanists.
Yeah.
I don't know what was there. It's too bad we don't know. The reason why we don't know is that in 550, the Bishop of Ephesus destroyed it. And that's the kind of final nail in the coffin. I'd love to know what they were. I'd love to know what charismatic people were going on pilgrimage for
Yeah.
to this. I know what was there. By the way, the reason why they thought it was going to come down there, they figured this out, having found these two sites. Apparently, the distance between the two towns matches exactly the dimensions of the New Jerusalem as described in the Book of Revelation.
Mm.
So this is the kind of thing you're talking about here. But the last, again, there are stray references afterwards. In 601, Gregory the Great writes a letter to the bishops of Spain reminding them that the baptism of Montanists is invalid, that maybe he's onto something, I don't know. Though there are ones much later, like in the 9th century, a patriarch of Constantinople writes a letter to the emperor urging him to do something about the Phrygian heretics, but that has to be a literary reference. They're well and gone by then. So I'd say by the end of the 7th century, you can say it's disappeared as an actual movement.
Got it. Yeah, sort of lingers in kind of the literature and the memory of it. But
Yeah, it becomes a thing, and it's there, and it's not. It usually isn't lumped with the greatest, like Gnosticism is one of the big ones,
Mhm.
but I think it's important because it does touch on things that are kind of. It's very peculiar to that age. It's also got some things that kind of recur
Mhm.
about it,
Yeah.
about the issue of inspirations, and we've talked about it, and maybe mental health in the modern world and stuff like that, but also authority, right? In times, it seems to me in times, and I'm a Roman Catholic, I believe in authority, I believe in institutional authority a lot,
Mhm.
but like all authorities become corrupt, all of them become, you can have bad bosses,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
People are going to look for things outside of that, and we are we have the Holy Spirit, and you have to have some way of sort of identifying. I said this. I found myself being a lot more, having more sympathy for the Montanists than I would have suspected. Like I'm like I
Sure.
don't really. Although in real life I actually know mostly charismatic Catholics, and I really like them a lot. I think they're really some of the better Christians that I know. But it is interesting. Like I understand much better the impetus. I think, right?
Mhm.
Why you would seek it, and the fact that it's legitimate to seek it. I mean, again, I hate to say I thought that way. I was like, oh, I'm doing all
Mhm.
this stuff and like you're gyro. But
Sure.
I think I get it better having learned more about the Montanist movement.
Yeah. Well, and thank you so much for talking about it. I do have one more question for you based
Sure.
on that wonderful story you told about the New Jerusalem. I was so just as prelude for why I'm thinking about this, as longtime listeners know, I live in Indiana, so I'm in the American Midwest. And some of my parishioners and we were doing a Bible study on Genesis, and they asked if anybody had ever identified the location of the Garden of Eden, because in Genesis it talks about where these four rivers meet, and I
Sure.
explained, yeah, there's no meeting point on a map for those, so nobody's ever found it. But I did mention that there are some people, and in this is especially true in Mormonism, who think that the Garden of Eden was in America, and in particular for
Yes.
Mormons, it's Jackson County, Missouri, and all
Yes.
of and this
I used
room
to
full
live
of
in Jackson County.
yeah. Well, and I apologize for what I'm about to have to say, but my parishioners kind of scrunched their noses and were like, Missouri? Like, with that like Midwest rivalry of like, what's so great about Missouri? Like, why wouldn't you have the Garden of Eden in Indiana? Like, we got better corn than them. Um,
Definitely. Yeah, he's absolutely correct, by the way.
yeah. So, do we have any records from the neighboring towns to this Montanist pilgrimage being like, ah, what's so great about that city? Why is the New Jerusalem going to be there? Because like that kind of rivalry just would
It would have
strike me
been
as very true to
something.
life.
You had pilgrims, but you would have. I mean, I would love to know more about that. It might have been. Bishop, like, hey, he's taking away from the sort of Orthodox pilgrimage site. We got to get rid of that. That might have been a motivation. You don't know. And I would just love to know. Maybe we'll find out from the archaeological explorations, but pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating story of the Montanists.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and enlightening us about this group. We're so glad to have you, Darrick.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.